The loading bay doors slammed shut behind him, and the whole concrete hallway shuddered like something alive. Trent Lawson pressed his back against the cold steel arms locked boots, slipping as the echo of a second impact rolled through the municipal courthouse basement. Somewhere on the other side of the barricade, a voice shouted his name, angry, terrified, and the fluorescent lights flickered to a sickly yellow. Dust rained from the ceiling. Sirens wailed overhead. A crack split across the wall beside him, widening with every vibration. The air smelled like scorched wiring. Trent didn't breathe, didn't blink. He'd seen this pattern before, just not here, not in this city, not with innocent people trapped inside. And when the muffled voice pleaded, "How did you know all he could manage was, because I've lived through the warning signs no one else ever notices." Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from tonight, and hit that like and subscribe button if you believe courage still matters in this world. Most folks in Harbor Mills knew Trent as the quiet court attendant who directed jurors to the right hallway and carried evidence boxes without complaint. At 41, he looked like any other overworked single parent juggling a government job and a kid in middle school. Every morning he packed lunch for his son Mason, double-checking homework and inhalers before driving the battered Ford to the courthouse, where he blended seamlessly with the beige walls and buzzing lights. But behind that calm exterior lived a man whose past was shaped by fire pressure waves and the split-second math of survival. Years earlier, Trent had been an Army combat engineer, the kind who specialized in routes breaching and recognizing danger before anyone else smelled it. He walked away from that life after one mission went sideways and took his wife with it, a loss that left him raising a boy who needed stability more than a hero with a medal. So Trent buried the soldier and built a routine breakfast at 6 school, drop-off courthouse by 8, home by 5 frozen pizza Fridays, science projects on Saturdays. Stability, predictability, quiet. But quiet never lasts. That Tuesday started with nothing more threatening than drizzle tapping the courthouse skylights. Trent clocked in, nodded to the sleepy sheriff's deputy, and settled at his desk to prep for the morning hearings. The daily noise of clacking heels and paper shuffling helped drown the old ringing in his ears. He watched the surveillance monitors while sipping stale coffee, scanning for nothing in particular, until something caught his eye. A delivery truck sat too close to the restricted entrance. Engine off. No driver in sight. A detail most people would ignore. But for Trent, certain angles, certain silences, certain patterns carried weight. And as he leaned closer, his stomach tightened. Mason's voice echoed in his head from the night before, reciting facts for a science quiz. Patterns predict outcomes, Dad. That's what my teacher says. Trent didn't know yet what this pattern meant, only that it was wrong. And moments later, when a stranger with a mismatched badge slipped through the staff door toward the mechanical wing alone, hurried, and too confident, Trent pushed aside his coffee, stood up from his desk, and felt that old instinct surge back into his bones. The day he'd tried so hard to make ordinary had just become the day everything changed. The courthouse buzzed louder than usual as Trent stepped out from the basement corridor, dusting concrete grit off his sleeves before anyone could notice. He tried to slow his breathing steady. His hands make himself look like nothing more than a middle-aged clerk who'd taken the stairs too fast. The last thing he wanted was attention. Attention led to questions, and questions led to history he spent years burying. But the moment he reached the main lobby, he knew something was off. 3 sheriff's deputies stood around the metal detectors talking in clipped tones. Their supervisor, Lieutenant Draper, was red-faced and pacing. A few feet away, the courthouse administrator, Helen Mathers, the kind of woman who believed rules were sacred and people were inconveniences, looked furious. And then her eyes locked onto Trent. "There you are," she snapped heels, striking the marble as she rushed at him. "Mr. Lawson, I've had 3 complaints this morning about you leaving your assigned station. You know protocol." Trent swallowed, keeping his voice even. "Ma'am, I saw something down by the loading." "We have procedures for a reason," she cut in sharply. "You are a court attendant. You escort jurors. You organize files. You do not under any circumstances go wandering into restricted areas." He opened his mouth to explain, but she turned to Lieutenant Draper instead. "Tell him what the deputies found." Draper didn't bother hiding his irritation. "We had to investigate because your employee," he jabbed a finger toward Trent, "claimed there was suspicious activity near the staff entrance. We wasted nearly an hour clearing a perfectly normal delivery." Trent blinked. The driver wasn't there. The badge didn't match, he said. Draper cut in, mimicking his calm voice. "I've got a bad feeling about this." The lieutenant shook his head. "Look, Lawson, you can't pull this stuff. Not here. We can't chase ghosts because you're jumpy." The word hit him square in the chest. Jumpy. That's what the Army psychologist wrote on a form years ago. Residual hypervigilance, persistent pattern recognition, possible trauma-related responses. He kept his voice low. "I didn't call you. I checked the cameras myself. Something wasn't right." Helen leaned closer, whispering harshly. "You disappear from your post again and we'll reevaluate whether this position is still a good fit." "Understood." He nodded. Because anything louder would have been dangerous. A few feet away, a cluster of attorneys had begun watching the scene. A few whispered. One shook his head. A secretary raised her eyebrows. The story was already spreading through the building. Quiet, Trent Lawson caused a scare. Again. He wished he could fade into the floor, but then he heard it, Mason's voice in the corner of his memory. "Dad, you always notice things other people don't. That's your superpower." He clung to that thought like a lifeline. By lunchtime, the day had bruised him in a dozen small ways. Helen reassigned him away from the front desk so you don't get distracted again and put him in records, a cramped room behind the clerk's office, where fluorescent lights hummed like angry bees. 2 younger clerks, Jared and Kelsey, sat across from him, whispering behind their monitors. They weren't subtle. "I heard he freaked out because of a delivery truck." "Yeah, guy thinks he's in some action movie. I heard he used to blow stuff up overseas. No wonder he's twitchy." They laughed softly. Trent kept filing motions and stamping pages, pretending he couldn't hear them. Pretending the ringing in his ears was just bad lights, not memories clawing up his spine. Pretending the pressure in his chest wasn't building. At 1:14 p.m., his phone buzzed. Mason's school. His heart stuttered. He excused himself, stepped into the hallway, and answered. "Dad." Mason's voice was small. Too small. The nurse called. "I had a little asthma thing during gym. I'm okay now, but they wanted you to know." Trent closed his eyes. "I'm on my lunch break. Do you need me to come get you?" "No, I'm fine," Mason whispered. "But can you just stay on the phone for a minute?" Trent leaned against the wall. "I'm here, buddy." He stayed like that until Mason's breathing steadied. But when he returned to records, Helen was standing at his desk with her arms crossed. "You vanished again," she said coolly. "Unacceptable. My son had an asthma." "The courthouse doesn't run on personal interruptions," she snapped. "If you need time off, request it. Otherwise, you stay at your station." Kelsey looked uncomfortable. Jared seemed amused. Trent unclenched his jaw slowly. I understand, ma'am. He didn't. Not really. But fighting her would have been pointless. By late afternoon, the building felt hostile in a way he couldn't quite articulate. Everyone seemed tense. Deputies muttered about delays. Attorneys glared at anyone who made more noise than a paper shuffle. Even the old janitor, Mr. Ballard, moved with a nervous energy Trent had never seen before. And the delivery truck still parked in the loading zone hadn't moved all day. That was wrong. Very wrong. Around 4:30, the courthouse prepared to close early for an evening maintenance sweep. People packed their things. Laughter and relief bubbled through the hallways. Another day done. But the ringing in Trent's ears had returned. Not the usual faint echo from old injuries. This was sharper, rhythmic, almost like a pulse. He paused near the service elevator, tilting his head. No one else reacted. No one else heard it. But to him, the air felt charged. He tapped the elevator button. Nothing happened. He tried again. Out of service. The hair on his arms rose. That elevator rarely went out of service. He turned toward the stairwell, but stopped short when Lieutenant Draper's voice barked behind him. "Lawson. Don't even think about going downstairs again." Trent raised his hands. "Lieutenant, something isn't right. That truck hasn't moved. The badge earlier didn't scan right. The elevator's down, and there's a Draper threw up a hand." "Enough. We're not indulging your paranoia again." He stepped closer. "Look, man, I get it. You've been through some stuff. But this is a courthouse, not Kandahar. Let the pros handle security." The words were meant to shut him down gently, but they sliced open something raw. Behind them, Jared walked by with a coffee and muttered, "He's probably hearing ghosts." Laughter followed him. Trent's pulse thudded in his temples. Draper sighed. "Why don't you head home? I think you need some rest." A dismissal disguised as kindness. Trent forced himself to breathe evenly. "I have an hour left on shift." "Then consider it a gift," Draper replied. "Go home." He walked away, leaving Trent in the hallway with the ringing in his ears and a growing sense of dread that no one else could feel. At home, Mason tried to brighten the evening. He'd made a microwave pizza and set out 2 plates. He even turned on their favorite nature documentary. But halfway through dinner, he looked up from his slice. "Dad, you're doing that thing again." Trent blinked. "What thing?" "You're looking at the walls like you're somewhere else." He tried to smile. Failed. Rough day at work. Mason pushed his plate aside. "Did someone say something?" He hesitated. Mason was 12, old enough to pick up on tension, young enough to think everything was fixable with honesty. "Just grown-up stuff," Trent said gently. "People don't always understand each other." Mason studied him for a long moment. "You always understand people," he said quietly, "even when they don't understand you back." Trent felt his throat tighten. "I try, buddy. And you always know when something's off." Mason leaned in. "You taught me that. Observing patterns, paying attention." Trent swallowed hard. "Yeah, Dad," Mason's voice softened. "If you noticed something today, don't ignore it." The echo of his own teachings came back like a punch. Observe, pay attention, act when something feels wrong. Trent didn't sleep that night. The next morning, the courthouse felt colder, quieter. People whispered about a maintenance shutdown scheduled for that afternoon. One that hadn't been on any calendar. Every clock in the hallways had been reset. A few security cameras blinked offline. The delivery truck was gone, but an oil stain remained where it had sat too long. Trent's gut twisted. He walked past Helen without greeting her, past Draper, past the metal detectors, straight toward the service staircase. He made it 3 steps before Draper grabbed his arm. "Lawson, don't." Trent turned slowly. "Lieutenant, if something happens here today, I need to be able to look my son in the eye and tell him I tried." Draper's expression softened for half a second, then hardened again. "I'm not letting you near that basement." Trent stepped back. Not confrontational, not hostile, just calculating. The ringing in his ears was louder now, a steady pattern. Intentional, familiar in a way that made the hairs along his neck rise. Something was in that building. Something no one else was listening for. "Go back to your station," Draper ordered. "That's final." Trent didn't argue. Not because he agreed, because arguing would waste seconds he could feel slipping away. He turned toward records, walked calmly, quietly. But halfway to his desk, the lights above him flickered. Once, twice, 3 times. A rhythm, a signal. And Trent Lawson, 41, tired, dismissed, carrying a past no one respected, felt every muscle in his body go rigid. Something big wasn't coming. It had already arrived. The lights steadied after the 3rd flicker, humming with that faint electric buzz the building always carried, but the rhythm beneath it wasn't normal. Not random, not accidental. It vibrated in Trent's bones like an old injury waking up. He stood frozen in the middle of the hallway, papers in hand, while clerks rushed past him toward the elevators. A judge strode by, annoyed about the tech outages. Someone dropped a stack of files, swore under their breath, scooped them up and kept going. No one noticed the subtle tremor that nudged through the tiled floor. No one heard the soft, pulsing whine from the service wing. But Trent did. It was the same cadence he'd heard once in a desert outpost, right before the world turned to dust and fire and sirens, and a voice screaming a name that never answered back. He dropped the paperwork, turned, and started walking fast. He didn't run. Running would draw attention. Running would bring Draper hollering after him. So he walked with purpose, sliding past a swarm of public defenders, past the clerk's desk, past Helen, barked orders about the maintenance shutdown. Then he cut left into the restricted hallway. A deputy saw him and stepped forward. "Hey, Lawson, you're not cleared?" "I know," Trent said quietly. "Go back upstairs." The deputy frowned. "You okay?" Trent paused, just long enough to look him dead in the eye. "No, but I'm doing the right thing." The man stared, uncertain, and stepped aside. Trent didn't wait for him to reconsider. He pushed through the door into the service corridor and locked it behind him. The hum hit him harder now, a vibration that traveled through the cinder block walls. Too steady, too intentional. And the air smelled faintly metallic, like scorched insulation. He'd been right. Something was down there. And if the timing matched the building schedule he'd memorized over the months, then the courthouse was minutes away from switching to off-peak power distribution, an automatic process that would leave the service wing running on a different electrical load. Exactly the kind of moment someone could exploit. His throat tightened. Mason's small voice echoed in his head. "Don't ignore it, Dad." He jogged the length of the hallway, turning into the stairwell that led to the mechanical levels. Halfway down, he heard footsteps somewhere below him. Fast. Purposeful. Then the unmistakable metallic clang of a panel slamming shut. Trent descended quietly, keeping his weight centered, stepping on the edges of the treads to dull the sound. He eased open the next door. The generator room was dim, lit only by a pair of emergency fixtures glowing in a washed-out red. And beside the main control cabinet, crouched on one knee, was a man in a gray maintenance uniform. But the uniform didn't match the badge clipped to the pocket. The badge blinked irregularly like a copied signal struggling to authenticate. Trent's chest tightened. The man was wiring something into the breaker array. Wires snaked across the floor toward a rectangular case the size of a toolbox. A device. Not a military-grade one. Not manufactured, but cobbled from off-the-shelf parts. Something made by someone who knew just enough to be dangerous. A homemade disruptor with the potential to overload the generator, trigger an arc flash, and blow half the courthouse into darkness, along with anyone standing too close. Trent stepped forward. "Don't move." The man jerked around, startled, then scowled. "Who the hell are you? Need to back away from that device right now." The man stood slowly, hands raised at waist-level, shoulders stiff. "Look, man, I don't want trouble. Just walk away and—" "No," Trent said, voice low. "That thing's wired for a cascade. You overload the main panel and the whole building becomes a trap." The man's eyes narrowed. "You know too much. You're doing this for a reason," Trent said. "But whatever it is hurting people isn't the answer." The man's jaw set. Nobody listened. Nobody cared. They threw me out like trash. A grievance, a vendetta. The same direction Trent feared. But motives didn't matter right now. The wiring behind the panel was already half-stripped copper exposed. If the man lunged, yanked a wire, tugged the wrong lead. Hundreds of people upstairs. Mason at school waiting for his dad to pick him up like he always did. No, that future wasn't negotiable. Trent stepped in slowly. "Listen, I'm not here to arrest you. I just need you to back away." "I can't," the man whispered. "They need to feel it. Need to know I mattered." Trent saw the twitch in his fingers, the kind that came right before panic turned into action. He moved. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. It was instinct, the kind carved into muscle by years spent kneeling in front of dangerous things. Trent lunged, grabbing the man's arm and twisting him away from the panel. The device clattered sideways, wires snapping loose. The man shouted, swinging wildly, but Trent shoved him down hard enough to knock the breath out of him. "Stay down," he warned. But the man kicked, catching Trent's shin, sending pain up his leg. Trent clenched his teeth, but didn't let go. He pinned the man's shoulders until the struggle slowed, then stopped. The man lay panting, furious, defeated. "You don't understand," he whispered. "No one listens until something breaks." "I listened," Trent said. "That's why you're still alive." He zip-tied the man's hands with a cable loop from the wall rack, then dragged him away from the panel. That was the easy part. Now came the dangerous one. The device lay half-open, wires bent and sparking. The breaker panel hummed a warning tone. The disruptor was active. A feedback surge pulsed through the conduits every few seconds like a heartbeat. One wrong move. He exhaled, steady and slow. He'd done this before. Not this exact thing, but enough variations that his mind automatically started mapping the circuitry. He crouched, studying the device. A bypass loop. A secondary coil tied to a timing module. A jerry-rigged capacitor bank that kept trying to discharge. Whoever built it was desperate, not skilled. But desperation could kill just as thoroughly as precision. He reached behind him, pulling a screwdriver from the emergency kit mounted on the wall. His hands stayed steady, because they had to. Because someone needed to walk Mason to school tomorrow. because he'd already lost enough people to bad decisions made by those too arrogant to listen. He grounded himself on the metal frame, touched the screwdriver tip to the first clamp. The feedback stuttered. Timing had to be perfect. He loosened the clamp, slid the wire free, caught it before it could brush anything live. The capacitor discharged with a sharp snap. A blue arc jumped, but fizzled harmlessly against the insulated flooring. He hissed under his breath, kept going, one wire at a time, one decision at a time. He followed the hum backward, disabling the disruptor's pulse generator. Then the signal relay. Then the coil that threatened to overload the entire distribution grid. When he removed the final link, the panel fell silent. The hum died. The air stilled. And the building took its first safe breath in what felt like hours. Trent leaned back against the concrete pillar, letting the adrenaline bleed out through his fingers. Footsteps thundered down the stairs behind him. A deputy burst into the room, gun-drawn, eyes widening when he saw the bound man on the floor. What, the Lawson? What did you? Before Trent could answer, Lieutenant Draper barreled in behind him. He stopped dead in the doorway, face draining of color. The scene told the story without explanation. The rigged disruptor, the exposed wires, the defeated saboteur. And Trent Quiet dismissed Trent, standing at the center of it all, the only barrier between catastrophe and the hundreds of people still sipping coffee upstairs. Draper lowered his gun slowly. Jesus, Lawson, you could have been killed. Trent met his eyes. Calm. Tired. I know. The would-be bomber spat bitterly from the floor. He ruined everything. Draper cuffed him, handing him off to the deputies. Then he turned back to Trent, with a look Trent hadn't seen from anyone in the courthouse not once in 8 months. Respect. Know something deeper. Recognition. Lawson Draper said quietly, "You need to come with me." The chief, the administrator. Everyone needs to hear what you have to say. Trent stared at him. Helen's going to fire me. Draper shook his head. Helen's about to find out she's been chewing out the only man in this building who actually knew what was happening. Above them, an alarm tripped softly through the ceiling vents, one the maintenance staff had never heard before. A safety interlock triggered by electrical tampering. Had Trent not intervened? The courthouse would have gone dark. The generators could have blown. People could have been trapped in elevators, in locked holding cells, in courtrooms without exits. Lives would have changed in seconds, but instead deputies streamed in now, wide-eyed, whispering, staring at Trent like they'd never really seen him before. In a way they hadn't. The quiet man nobody listened to had just saved the entire building. And for the first time in years, Trent Lawson didn't feel invisible. He felt necessary. The generator room emptied fast once deputies hauled the saboteur upstairs, leaving Trent standing alone in the dim red glow. The silence felt heavier now, not the dangerous kind, but the stunned kind that clings to a building after disaster has been narrowly avoided. Sparks still sizzled faintly near the panel, the air sharp with ozone, the smell of a catastrophe that almost happened. Somewhere far above, courthouse workers murmured in confusion as fire doors reset and ventilation restarted. Footsteps echoed down the concrete stairwell. Lieutenant Draper returned first, followed by 2 deputies who kept glancing at Trent like they were trying to decide whether to salute him or keep a safe distance. Behind them came Administrator Helen Mathers, her heels clicking like cracking ice. Her expression was tight-controlled until she saw the dismantled device, the exposed wiring, the charred panel. Then her face drained of color. What exactly happened here?" she whispered. Draper gestured lightly toward Trent. He stopped it. All of it. Helen stared at him, really stared, as if seeing him for the first time in 8 long months. You work in records. Trent nodded once. No triumph, no spite, just tired acceptance. A dozen questions flickered across her face, none of which she seemed able to form into words. Draper stepped closer to the panel, shaking his head. Ma'am, if that disruptor had overloaded the generator, we'd be evacuating this place in the dark right now. Or worse. Helen gripped the railing to steady herself. How did he even know? How did he identify this before anyone upstairs noticed something was wrong? Trent didn't answer, not because he was hiding, but because he had no interest in drawing attention to himself. But Draper seemed to sense the moment demanded the truth. Because Draper said, turning toward her, "He's not who we thought he was." Helen blinked slowly. What are you talking about? Draper exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. After the deputies brought the suspect up, we ran him through the system. His badge was fake, his ID was fake, but his fingerprints popped. He's been terminated from 2 private security firms in the last year for erratic behavior and tampering with equipment. He jerked his head toward the floor. And Lawson here recognized every step before it happened. Helen frowned, recognized how Draper didn't answer. He looked to Trent instead. Trent didn't move. He didn't want this moment. He didn't want eyes on him. He didn't want to reopen the part of himself he'd buried for Mason's sake, a part filled with memories of a desert base, a dust storm, the sickening rhythm of a device that hummed like a heartbeat seconds before the blast that took his wife. But he also knew he couldn't stay invisible anymore. So he inhaled deeply, held the cold air in his lungs, and said quietly, "This isn't the first time I've seen someone use a disruptor like that." Helen blinked. "What do you mean? That's not something a courthouse clerk should know." "No," he agreed softly. "It's something a combat engineer would know. Someone who specialized in identifying threats people didn't believe were real until it was too late." Draper watched him closely. Helen waited. Trent finally lifted his eyes to meet hers. "I served 12 years in the Army. Route clearance, infrastructure security, hazard recognition. I left after a mission went bad because a superior officer ignored a pattern I'd flagged." His jaw tightened. "People died, including someone I loved." Silence filled the room. Thick, heavy, human. Helen's chin wavered just slightly. "Your personnel file. It didn't say I don't list it," Trent said. "I came here for quiet, for stability, for my son, not for recognition." One of the deputies muttered, "Jesus." Draper nodded slowly, every puzzle piece aligning. "That's why you noticed things. The stalls, the badge, the elevator outage, the flickering lights." Helen's cheeks reddened with shame. "I told you to stay at your station. I accused you of being paranoid." "You were doing your job," Trent said gently. "No," she whispered. "No, I wasn't. I dismissed you." The words trembled with more weight than he expected from her. She stepped forward, voice breaking. "I put the entire courthouse at risk because I thought you were just an attendant." Trent didn't answer. He didn't need to. Her expression said she finally understood. Behind her, Draper straightened. "The chief wants him upstairs immediately, and Homeland Security is already asking for a debrief." Helen looked at Trent again, eyes softening into something close to awe. "They're asking for you. They want to know how I recognized the pattern," Trent said simply. Draper pointed up the stairs. "Come on, you're needed." As they started to leave the generator room, Helen lingered near the doorway. Mr. Lawson Trent paused. She swallowed hard. "I was wrong about you. Deeply wrong." Trent nodded once. "Thank you, ma'am." But she wasn't finished. "And I think you might be exactly what this courthouse needs. Far more than I ever realized." The weight of her words followed him up the stairwell. The third-floor conference room was crowded. Chief deputies, emergency responders, building inspectors, 2 city legal advisors, and the courthouse operations director. Conversations stopped immediately when Trent entered. The chief, a broad-shouldered man with silver hair, motioned him to take a seat at the long table. "I'm told the chief began that you prevented a catastrophic breach this afternoon." Trent shrugged lightly. "I just saw what others didn't." One of the legal advisors leaned forward. "No. You recognized a tampering method our own specialists missed." Another spoke. "And you neutralized the device." "Alone." A murmur rippled through the room. The chief opened a tablet. "I've reviewed your employment file. Your references are pristine. Your evaluation's conservative, almost intentionally modest." He lowered the tablet. "But I've also reviewed your military record. You should have been supervising security operations, not escorting jurors." Heat crept up Trent's neck. "I didn't want more responsibility. I wanted a stable job that wouldn't follow me home." A gentle knock interrupted the room. Trent turned. Mason stood in the doorway, small backpack on his shoulders, escorted by the school's resource officer. "Sorry to interrupt," the officer said. "He said he needed to see his dad, and that it was important." Trent's breath caught. "Mason," he whispered. His son ran straight into his arms. Trent pulled him close, burying his face in Mason's hair. "You're okay," Mason breathed. "The news said something happened downtown, and the school said you weren't answering your phone." "I'm fine," Trent murmured. "I'm right here." The entire room watched in silence. A few people looked down, embarrassed by the things they'd called him over the months. Quiet, odd, jumpy, just a clerk. The chief cleared his throat. "Lawson, Mr. Lawson, what you did today is beyond brave. You saved lives. And you did it knowing full well that nobody here believed you." Trent kept an arm around Mason, resting his hand on his son's shoulder. "I didn't need anyone to believe me," he said softly. "I just needed to make sure he had a father to come home to." The room went still. Helen dabbed at her eyes. One of the legal advisors muttered, "Damn." Draper spoke up from the back. "Chief, there's something else." The chief nodded. "Go ahead." "We reviewed the footage," Draper said. "Lawson didn't just disable a threat. He tracked the saboteur's movements before any alarm triggered. He predicted where the breach would occur. He moved with intention the entire time." Draper looked at Trent, his expression equal parts respect and regret. He didn't get lucky. He knows this stuff. The chief folded his hands. "Mr. Lawson, I'd like to propose something." Trent looked up warily. The chief continued. "This courthouse has been overdue for an overhaul in safety, security, auditing, and emergency action procedures for years. After today, it's clear we've been doing things the wrong way." He paused. "But maybe now we know the right person to lead us into doing it correctly." Helen nodded beside him. "Head of Security Integration." A few people gasped. One whispered, "He went from records to running the place." Mason squeezed Trent's arm. "Dad, that's huge." The chief wasn't smiling. This wasn't flattery. This was necessity. "We need someone who doesn't just know the rules but knows how danger actually works. Someone who can see what ordinary people miss." all eyes turned to Trent. For a moment, memories of desert wind and shattered tents, and a life he thought he'd left behind, flickered across his mind. He could almost smell the sand, feel the ringing heat of the explosion he'd never stopped hearing. Then he felt Mason's fingers tighten around his sleeve. "Dad," Mason whispered. "You always told me patterns matter. Maybe this one led you here." Trent exhaled slowly. The chief leaned in. "You don't have to decide tonight, but I need your answer soon. This building won't be safe without someone like you guiding us." The room waited. The reveal had landed. The power had shifted. And now the next step, whatever it was, belonged to Trent alone. The conference room emptied slowly, people filing out with hushed voices and sidelong glances, none of them the dismissive looks Trent had grown used to over the past 8 months. Now it was gratitude, respect, a quiet kind of awe. Even the deputies who used to joke about him hearing ghosts approached with firm handshakes and awkward pats on the shoulder. Helen Mathers lingered last. She stood in the doorway a moment, smoothing the front of her blazer, then stepped toward him with a breath that sounded like release. "I owe you an apology," she said. "Not just for today, for every time I underestimated you." She hesitated before adding, "I don't know how you carried all that experience alone, but I'm grateful you were here when it mattered." Trent nodded, accepting the words for what they were, a bridge being rebuilt. "Thank you." When Mason and Trent finally stepped into the hallway, the building felt different. Workers who rarely looked up from their phones paused to smile or nod. The janitor gave him a thumbs up. Even Jared, the young clerk who'd mocked him, mumbled, "Good job, Lawson," and looked at his shoes like the floor might swallow him. By the time Trent walked his son outside into the late afternoon light, he wasn't invisible anymore. For the first time in years, he felt seen not for the uniform he used to wear or the mistakes he carried in his heart, but for the man he still chose to be, even after losing so much. That night after dinner, Mason sat cross-legged on the couch working on a science project, while Trent stared quietly at the job offer sitting on the table. Head of Security Integration sounded like a burden he wasn't sure he could lift. But then Mason spoke without looking up. "Dad, I think you're ready." "For what?" Mason tapped a pencil against his notebook. "To stop blaming yourself for what happened back then, and to help people again, like you always wanted." Trent looked at his son, the boy who'd inherited a gentleness Trent never had, a steadiness Trent fought for every day. Mason wasn't asking for a hero. He was reminding his father he already was one. Trent set his hand over his son's. "You really think I can do it?" "I know you can." The next morning, Trent signed the offer. 6 weeks later, the courthouse felt like a different building entirely. The old flickering lights had been replaced. New security procedures were installed. Training workshops carried Trent's name. And for the first time in its history, the courthouse formed a safety advisory committee, half sworn officers, half civilian staff. Trent oversaw all of it, not from an ivory tower, but side by side with the same people he used to walk past unnoticed. He taught them how to read patterns, how to trust instincts, how to see danger before it showed its teeth. And he did it without ego, without bravado, just quiet clarity born from experience. Even Helen participated, arriving early to every meeting and staying late to ask questions she once would have dismissed as unnecessary. Draper, humbled by how close he'd come to ignoring the wrong man, started referring to Trent as our quiet compass, a nickname that spread faster than Trent liked. And Mason. He walked taller at school, proud, in a way kids are, when they finally understand their parents' strength. His asthma eased with the stress at home lifting. He even asked if he could help design emergency kits for the courthouse's new community outreach program. The saboteur eventually faced trial, the courtroom filled with people who knew how close they'd come to tragedy. Many of them sat quietly in the gallery, casting grateful glances toward Trent. He avoided the attention as best he could, but Mason squeezed his hand every time the evidence was shown, grounding him in the life he was fighting to build. By the time autumn rolled in a crisp breeze circling fallen leaves across the courthouse steps, Trent finally felt something he hadn't felt in more than a decade. Peace. Not because the past was gone, it would never be, but because the weight of it had finally found a place to rest. One evening, after a long day of planning new safety drills, Trent walked Mason to the car. The sky was turning gold. Workers were heading home. Helen stood near the entrance chatting with Draper, the two of them laughing at something shared. When they spotted Trent, both lifted a hand in greeting. Mason slid into the passenger seat, while Trent lingered for a moment, letting the wind carry the sounds of the city around him. It felt like a second chance he never asked for, but had been given anyway. Mason rolled down the window. "Dad, you coming?" Trent smiled. "Yeah, just taking one last look." He got in, buckling his seatbelt, the setting sun painting warm light across the dashboard. "You know," Mason said as they pulled out of the parking lot, "Ms. Wade at school asked us what courage means. I told her it's when someone keeps helping people even when nobody notices, even when it costs them something." Trent glanced over his throat, tight. "What did she say?" "She said that sounds like someone I know." Trent looked back at the courthouse as it faded in the rearview mirror, the place where he'd come to disappear, and the place where he'd been asked, at long last, to step forward. Some stories are loud, some arrive with sirens and fanfare, but the ones that stay, the ones that matter, are born quietly out of duty, out of loss, out of the simple belief that protecting others is worth whatever it asks of you. And sometimes, if you're lucky, they lead you right where you were meant to be all along.